first webinar. We're delighted that you have joined us today. I'm Ingrid Nielsen, Chair of the WASHA Education Committee, and I'll be facilitating the webinar today. We have a great speaker for you on a timely topic. Many of you may have heard about the 29-year-old woman, Brittany Maynard. It was in the news last fall, who had an aggressive brain cancer. And she moved to the state of Oregon to take advantage of their death with dignity law to end her life on her own terms. And there's been more and more public discussion about end-of-life choices. There was a town hall meeting here in Seattle a week ago. Atul Gawande's recent book, Being Mortal, provides a really thoughtful discussion about individuals making their own choices at end of life. And even yesterday, the New York Times had a front page article about teenagers and young adults who are faced with these decisions. So we couldn't be more pleased to have Karen Griffith with us today. She is a client support volunteer with Compassion and Choices of Washington. She's going to talk about Washington State's Death with Dignity Act. She's going to clarify what it is and just what it isn't. Karen is a former director of volunteers for hospice. She's currently on the board of Jefferson Healthcare Hospice Foundation in Port Townsend. She has a passion for educating others on what their end-of-life choices are, and she's helped many clients walk their final journey. So I would just want to make one logistics comment. We are recording this talk so that we have the opportunity to post it at a later point. Based on your computer's bandwidth, there is a slight delay between questions and when you hear the answer. And for that reason, we're asking that you type your questions at any point during the presentation, and Karen will either try to address them within her talk, or if they are unanswered at the end of her slides, she will address them at that point. So thank you so much for joining us today, and I'm going to turn it over to Karen.
Hello, everyone. I'm so glad that you could join us this afternoon. I'm awfully sorry that I can't look into all of your faces, but I'm very pleased to be asked to do this. I'm always interested in spreading good, accurate information about this very interesting law that we have in our state. So the purpose of our time together, 2 or 3 things. First of all, learn about what Compassion and Choices of Washington does. I have a feeling that not a lot of you know as much about it as we'd like you to know about. Secondly, learn about what the Death with Dignity law is. How does it work? What are some of the safeguards, and who actually is using it? So first, let's look at Compassion and Choices and what is the mission. So the mission of Compassion and Choices, really bottom line, is to make sure everyone who wants to end their life in a peaceful and humane way can do so. We do it in a number of ways. First of all, we try and educate, as we're doing today, educate people about their end-of-life issues. What are they? How they can deal with them. A big part of what we do is help people in the preparation of their advance directives. And it's a big part of helping people have the kind of death that they'd like by specifying in advance and choosing a really good healthcare agent so that they can make sure that their wishes are honored at the end of life. Next, we provide free, and I really want to underline free, client support services all throughout the state to help people understand what their choices are and to really support them completely through the dying process. In fact, that's one of my roles as a client support volunteer, is that I am often there on the very day of the death. And finally, to uphold access to Washington's Death with Dignity law. You know, according to the Washington State Department of Health, 10 out of 10 of us will not leave this world alive. In fact, we found that death is the #1 killer of everyone. And most of us have given much more attention to very other events in our life than we have about how we're going to leave this life. We spend months planning a cruise. We think a lot about our careers, but we really don't put a lot of thought into how we're going to end this life. And we need to be thinking about how we leave this earth. To quote from a couple of sisters, there's a great book called A Better Way of Dying by Jean and Eileen Fitzpatrick. One of the sisters is an attorney, and the other one is a doctor, and they wrote this book about how to have a better way of dying. And they said this, and the reason I'm quoting this is I want to put you sort of in a frame of mind to understand why people would choose to use the death with dignity law. So many times when we talk about death with dignity, the pushback on it is, well, we really don't want to snuff out any hope. We really want people to always have hope. But what they're failing to understand is that there begins to be a time when there is no more hope. And here's what the sisters said about it, and I'll just read it to you if you don't mind. For most of us, death will not come suddenly. Instead, it will approach slowly by way of a gradual decline into chronic illness. We are likely to spend the last years of our lives slowly losing the things that make life worth living. First, the enjoyment of a vigorous life. Next, our ability to socialize. And then our ability to reason and even care for ourselves. Eventually, we may fall into a state of physical suffering, dependence, and isolation, locked in a process of decline from which death is the only escape, or slowly into the fog of Alzheimer's dementia, gradually losing reason and intellect in a relatively healthy way. So what are some of the things that are really contributing to this slow decline? Well, we've had a lot of huge medical advances in our lifetime. First of all, people are being kept alive longer by those advances in medicine. And I'm really talking about things like modern drugs, chemo, radiation, statins, beta blockers, MRIs, laser and microscopic surgery, insulin, gene therapy, organ transplants, dialysis, etc., etc. And the question then becomes, how are we going to live? And I think a lot of us think as we get toward the end of our life, we'll just wait until we hear our own physician say, Karen, I'm sorry, there's really nothing more I can do for you. But you know what? Physicians never say that. They always say, there's something more I can do. So we really need to have a way when we get to the end of life where our choices have run out in terms of curative medicine, that we can again assure we can have that peaceful death. So let's get right into it and talk about Initiative 1000, because that's what it was called back in 2007 and 8 when people all over the state were collecting signatures. And maybe you remember being one of those people who signed a petition, and maybe you remember voting on it. It passed in November of 2008. It went into effect a few months later in March of 2009. Almost 60% of the voters in the state of Washington approved it. It passed overwhelmingly in 30 of our 39 counties, and it's modeled on a very successful Oregon law. We thought, why reinvent the wheel? I thought you might be interested in some of the states that also allow death with dignity. So the first one, of course, is Oregon in 1994, and it was challenged and went to the Supreme Court and was affirmed in 1997. We became the second state, as I said, 5 years ago, and Vermont in 2013 passed it. The interesting difference between those is this. Oregon and Washington passed it through an initiative, getting it on a ballot as an initiative. Vermont, however, passed it through their legislature. And then parts of Montana and New Mexico. So there were lawsuits in district court in those two states, and it was affirmed in portions of Montana and New Mexico. And this year, bills have been introduced in 17 states. We don't know what the outcome will be, and often we found that the initiative or the bill has to be reintroduced multiple times over the course of a few years, but we're very optimistic that ultimately this will be passed throughout our country. I also thought you might be interested to know sort of internationally where it's enabled, and it's in Switzerland, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg, and as of January of this year, the Canadian Parliament passed the law. That will be effective in January of next year for the entire state. Now, what do you think is the history of aid in dying? And you may be surprised to know this, that doctors have been aiding people who were close to death long before the passage of the law. And generally speaking, it was done very quietly and very discreetly. It was often done by a prescription of a pain medication that, if taken in excess, would cause the death of the patient. And no physician was ever prosecuted for a patient misusing his or her medication. It's interesting how when polls are conducted, the variation in the way the question is asked often will impact the answer that people give. This is the secret behind political polls that can really reveal sort of two different opinions depending on how the question is worded. So the New York Times, a year ago this month, asked this question, a man on the street sort of question. When patients want it, doctors should be allowed to, quote, end the patient's life by some painless means. And before I reveal how many people agreed with this statement, just put a mental percentage in your own mind. Just take a second. What would you guess? And here's the actual figure. 70% of the general population agreed to this statement. Now notice how this is worded. Same question, sort of, just a little bit different wording. Doctors should help a dying patient commit suicide. And notice that commit suicide, I think probably the minute you read that gave you a little start, because it's a very sort of negative picture in your mind, and you would probably not be surprised to know that the answer to that question was lower. But how low do you think it went? Put a little percentage in your mind. And it actually was 50%. So even when it's worded in a kind of the scary term, commit suicide, half the people asked still said, I believe it should be something a dying patient should do. So one of the things that I would like to have you take away from our time together is that language does matter, and that terminology is very important. So people who sort of are against the death with dignity like to use inflammatory, sort of scary terminology. And I see this all the time in articles when this is being talked about. So the first thing I would hope that you would do is take away from this correct terminology. So first of all, what it isn't, what death with dignity isn't. First of all, it is not euthanasia. Euthanasia is a death wherein a physician directly administers a life-ending medication. We see examples in that with a veterinarian putting a pet down, or a sort of Dr. Kevorkian, and we do not do that. Involuntary euthanasia is capital punishment, where there's clearly not any kind of agreement on the part of the convict. So what we're not about is euthanasia. We're also not assisted suicide, which is still illegal in Washington. It's a Class C felony, and I looked it up, and it's actually illegal in every single state. So what is it about suicide that makes it different? Well, suicide is usually committed by someone who is in a depressed frame of mind. It is usually a fairly violent act. It is usually done in solitude. It is almost always done without the awareness on the people that the person leaves behind. And it almost always leaves terrific psychological aftershocks. And unlike an assisted suicide, this person with death with dignity does not have the choice to choose life or death. In assisted suicide, should they have gotten some counseling and perhaps some medication, they really face a full lifespan. But for people using death with dignity, that choice is no longer left to them. They are terminally ill. So it's not these three things. Help us out by using correct terminology as you talk to other people you work with, and talk about what it is. It is aid in dying or physician-assisted dying. Now let's look at how the law works. It took a lot to get it passed. There was a lot of opposition, and we really had to think about all the people and the factions that would be resistant to it, and we really had to make sure that we addressed those. So here's what the law says. First of all, only mentally competent people can use the law. And unfortunately, that therefore eliminates people with dementia or Alzheimer's from using it. So you have to be in a reasonably sane mindset to use the law. You have to have received a prognosis or a life expectancy of 6 months or less, which is, by the way, the same criteria people have to be admitted on hospice. They have to be over the age of 18 and a resident of Washington. And they can actually prove their residency in 2 or 3 easy ways. It's a driver's license, it's a mortgage, it's a lease, it's utility bills at the place you're residing. And it requires the support of 2 physicians. And the person must be able to self-administer the medication. So one of the things that we do as an organization is help people work their way through this process. And we have trained, compassionate volunteers all across the state of Washington to help people through this process. Now, there were a lot of safeguards built into the law. First one, by law, other alternatives have to be offered to patients coming into their doctor seeking to use the law. So those other alternatives, among other things, are palliative care and hospice care and other things, and I'll show you those in a moment. So in other words, a person has to be told there are other ways we can treat you, there's other things we can do, so that they're not just funneled in the first request to our process. Sound mental health has to be ascertained, and I said that before, that only people that are mentally competent can do this. And if there's any question on the part of the doctor about the mental competency of the person, they are sent for a psychological evaluation. 2 physicians have to certify the terminal prognosis. There's a 15-day waiting period between the first and the second oral request. The client is counseled by the physician, to inform their family. Now notice it does not say required. And we usually have family members who do involve their family, their nearest and dearest, a spouse, some of their grown children. But we also have certain clients who say, my daughter is very much against this, and I'm choosing not to inform her about this. We encourage them to do so, but they're not required to do so. And the client may change their mind at any time, so that up to the moment that they are ingesting this medication, they can stop the process. They can say, you know what, I've changed my mind. And it's not unusual for us to have clients who, even after getting the medication, just knowing they've got peace of mind from having the medication, maybe change their mind and say, let nature take its course. So I always like to face the elephant in the room by talking about who opposes and why do people oppose it. So one of the things they say, it's a moral violation, which is bound in their religious ethics. In other words, it's a sin, that life is sacred and only God can say when the end of life is, or it's such a tragic choice, why did they choose this one? Or suffering. Many religions believe that suffering is actually a necessary part of the dying process, and then people might be pushed to die early for the convenience of others. Now this is the argument that we call the slippery slope, and I'm sure you've probably heard that before. In other words, they say, you know, we really shouldn't have a law like this, because first we'll be taking all the people with dementia that have become burdensome to their family, and then we might have the people with physical or other mental disabilities take this medication, and we're going to have grandma take it because we're spending our family fortune keeping grandma in an assisted living. But there are so many safeguards built into the system that no one can be coerced into it who doesn't want to take the medication. Proponents of death with dignity, I'm going to say, is just very simply, people feel very strongly, it's my death, it's my decision, it's for me to take that action. And quite frankly, we have 10 years of proper use of death with dignity in the state of Oregon. And there have been, so far, no reported abuses of the law either in Oregon or Washington. And that is so because the safeguards work. I thought you might be interested in some statistics about how the law is being used or who's using it. And these are from 2013, and I looked recently, as recent as this past week, to see if the 2014 statistics are on the website yet, and they aren't. So we ascertain what are your end-of-life concerns, and here's what people are saying. You might think that one of the highest reasons people do this is a fear of pain, but quite honestly, that's about 7th or 8th on the list. So the first one is losing a sense of autonomy. Who am I? Who did I used to be? I'm losing it. I'm no longer the vigorous, active person that I am. I'm less able to engage in the activities that make life enjoyable. I used to hike and fish and play chess and square dance, and now my life has been confined to a hospital bed, and I'm staring at a whiteboard at the foot of that hospital bed or some such. And then the third one that's in that same area is loss of dignity. And if you think of these three, they're pretty existential reasons. They don't have to do with the physical pain of dying. They have to do with the enjoyment of life and losing who you are. Other statistics. The number of people in 2013 who, under the law, obtained life-ending medication. And I want you to guess that for a second before I reveal it. Think about the population of the state of Washington is 7 million. There's probably a few thousand people that die every year in the state. So of that, the number of people who came to us or used the law to obtain the life-ending medication, only 179. Is it lower than what you thought? Is it higher? And then out of that 179, how many people actually ended up using the medication, or how many died without using the medication? So kind of think of a number lower than 179, and it's 119. So in all of the state in 2013, it was really only 119 people who took advantage of the law. More statistics. A little more than half were married. Fewer more men than women took advantage of it. About half held a bachelor's degree. For most of them, this probably doesn't surprise you, the diagnosis was cancer. Down below that was heart disease and pulmonary disease and neuromotor function disease. But cancer was the number one. And remember I said they weren't required to inform their family of their decision, but overwhelmingly most people had the support and the company of the family at the very end. And 85% were on hospice, and almost the same amount were at home at the time of death. So remember earlier when I said that part of the law is that physicians inform the patient about other alternatives. Let's talk about what are those other alternatives. So the first one that a doctor would recommend, and certainly we recommend when we have patients that are interested in end-of-life choices, is hospice care. And hopefully all of you in the audience today are aware of how fabulous hospice is, and that it's usually covered by Medicare, and that offers 24/7 round-the-clock care by or on-call services by a case manager, and medications are provided, and durable medical equipment is provided, and chaplains and social workers visit the patient. It's absolutely fabulous. And we always try and get our clients on hospice care. Secondly, palliative care is really becoming more and more common throughout the state. There's a wonderful program at UW in palliative care to get certified in it, and it is a kind of care that really works on making patients comfortable and pain-free at the end of their life. The next one is something we call VSED, voluntarily stopping eating and drinking. So this is knowingly stopping your intake of food and liquid with the understanding that it will hasten one's death. And it's a fairly painless way of dying. I've had one of my patients choose this, and it took him about 10 days. And we always urge people who are going to do this to go on to hospice, so hospice can help with symptom management, like perhaps some agitation, dry mouth, etc. But it's fairly painless. People have reported that after about the third day, the endorphins sort of kick in, and they're no longer hungry, and it's a very peaceful way to go. Another option is stopping some sort of treatment. So there may be a medication that the person is taking that is sort of life-sustaining. There may be a dialysis. There may be chemotherapy or radiation. So the person has the right to stop that treatment, knowing again that it will hasten their death. Or they can choose not to even start a treatment. So they can say, no, I don't want to go through chemo. I don't want to go through radiation. I'm just going to let nature take its course. So all of these options are laid out to our clients when they call us, and doctors go through these options too. So in summary, we are not just death with dignity. We try to help you have a humane and peaceful death, and we have no agenda except to help you understand your end-of-life choices and ensure that you're honored. Next, I'd like to show you a short video about death with dignity. Give me a minute. Technical difficulties. There we go.
I think the client that touched me most and has stayed with me was a young man from eastern Washington, close to the Idaho border, who had been diagnosed with Lou Gehrig's disease, or ALS, in the spring of 2008. When my husband was diagnosed with brain cancer, we joined a brain tumor support group, and we became very close to the other members in the group, and then we watched as all of them died. So my husband witnessed what his death was going to be like. He didn't want to go through that, and he didn't want me to have to see that.
In 1994, my partner was diagnosed with AIDS, and he became increasingly ill, and eventually he qualified for hospice. And during the course of his illness, his pain and symptoms like agitation were very difficult to manage.
It has been my belief as a physician that providing comfort to my patients at the end of life was one of my most important responsibilities.
He really wanted to end his life, but he was unable, and so he was relying on me to help him. Unfortunately, I couldn't find any information from anyone. When I asked the hospice provider, they said, we don't do that. We don't provide information to help people hasten the dying process.
When I was younger, my mom had a friend who died of AIDS, and she didn't want to talk about it. She just came home one day from his funeral and left a brochure for hospice on the kitchen table. And not having talked about death before or illness with my mom, I decided to look at the brochure, and that's when I decided that this was something I really wanted to be a part of. So I started volunteering at a hospice when I was 17.
I've worked with a lot of folks from different walks of life, different diseases, and one of the things that I've noticed is there's one thing they have in common, and that is that look of determination that they have on their face when they're ready to take the medication. I don't know any Olympic athletes, but it's got to be similar. You know, when they're ready to compete, there's a determination and a look of resolve, and that's what's on the look on these folks' faces, because they've done a lot of wrestling, they've done a lot of soul searching, dealing with their own mortality, and when they've made the decision to take the medication, they're ready.
I think he was unique even as he took his medication, and he took it with great determination. He said he was looking forward to seeing what the next step was. As he said, either a long dirt rest or a chance to see the people and dogs that he loved so much that he'd lost.
We all gathered in the bedroom, and then Sarah came up with the cup with the medication in it. Meg held it in her good hand, and by the time she'd finished the half cup of liquid, she was asleep. And within about 10 minutes, she was dead. It was quiet, it was tranquil, it was peaceful, and she was with her family. So it's about as good a death as I can imagine.
I had a patient who was dying of cancer And she qualified under the law and prepared by inviting all her family, friends, and her close neighbors to her place, which was on an island looking out over the water. And on the day we all arrived, she went outside, got outside into her hammock, looking out over the water. And before she took the medicine, we all stood around holding hands, singing her favorite songs. And everyone hugged her, and she hugged everyone and whispered her love to them all. And then she peacefully settled into the sunset. It was the most peaceful dying I could imagine.
When she decided to take the medication, we all gathered around her bed. They gave her kisses, and we all raised a glass, a toast to her, except she raised her glass of the medication. And she said, you know, here we go. And everyone took a drink, and she fell asleep within 30 seconds or a minute or so, and she just laid down and fell asleep.
He ended up dying very slowly and very painfully in February of 1996 after about a week in a coma. And I was with him when he died, and it was a beautiful sunny morning, and I was sitting next to him with my hand on his chest, and I got up to open the blinds and let the sun in the room, and while my back was turned, he died.
I strongly believe that there is no value to suffering during the time of dying, and no value in suffering at the end of life.
His death was horrible. It was painful. It was ugly for both him and me. He didn't want anybody to ever have to go through that again like he did. And he didn't want anybody to have a family member to go through that like I did. And that's why this law is so important.
They didn't get to choose what happened to them. They didn't get to choose the fact that they had this terrible disease that's taking their life. But thank goodness we have a law that lets them have some form of control about how that life is going to end. That they have some kind of control. They get to have the last word. And my job is to make sure that they get to have that.
Just the thought that he could say goodbye to his family, they could say goodbye to him. He could actually rest without going through that long agonizing period of being drugged up like he had seen my mom. My dad had fought a lot of battles in his life, and after all the fights he's won, when he found out that he wasn't going to win this one, I really think he deserved a rest.
I think it helps people to realize that this is not a choice between life and death. These folks cannot choose life any longer, but they should be able to choose between one kind of death and another kind of death.
When I think about the end of my life, I believe strongly that it is my life, it will be my death, and it should be my choice.
This is contact information for us, Compassion and Choices of Washington. We are, as you are, a nonprofit organization, and we're funded by donations from generous people and from grants. And we have fabulous information on our website, compassionwa.org. So I urge any of you to look on our website and find all kinds of end-of-life materials and our advance directives and notice of upcoming events, etc. So we now have time for some questions. If you want to type in some questions, I would be very happy to answer them.
And this is the facilitator. If you see on the left side of your screen, there's a question mark. And because of the delay in the video, I will just relay them to our speaker. If you have any questions at this point, go ahead and type them in. So I don't see any questions coming in. Those come in a live format. So at this point, is there any other comments that you wanted to make, Karen?
No, I'm just happy to have this privilege to get this word out to such a fine organization as WASHA.
Well, thank you so much. We really appreciate your information and clarifying what the Death with Dignity Act is in Washington State. And I'll actually put our slide up right now, Karen, so we have that. And I wanted to also remind people a little bit about who we are. And the slide you're seeing is the mission, vision, values of WASHA. And we seek to educate and empower individuals and increase this dialogue about health advocacy in this changing healthcare environment. And we really thank Karen for her efforts today and helping us understand a real important choice that patients, at least in Washington State, and as I learned today, a lot of other states are going to have. So in conclusion, what will happen now is that when we stop the live broadcast, you're going to get redirected to the webinar page for WASHA. And on this page, there's a brief post-event survey, and you can click on that, and we would sure appreciate any feedback you have, given this is our first webinar, and we're kind of testing out this Webinars on Air Google platform. And so you can either click on the link and fill out the survey, or it will also be emailed to you. And there's another link on that page, which is the information about registering for CEU credits. This program is approved for 1 credit hour of continuing education for nurses and social workers. And if you haven't already signed up, you can still register. And there is a cost of $25 for that. And you can do that right on the webinar page. But if you've already signed up, you should have received an instruction sheet with an email address to take a brief post test. And once you complete that, you will receive an immediate CEU certificate in your email. And you can do that at any point. And so on this final slide, we have the webinar address, but also on the website you can find this. But if you need to contact us or email us about anything at all, just go to info@washa.org. That's info@washa.org. And we look forward to hearing from you and hearing your feedback. And I want to thank you all for attending today, and have a wonderful day.